I'm Lee Eggerman, and welcome to the premiere edition of Eye of the Cat. Today we have 3 segments that I'm sure you'll find interesting and thought-provoking. The first one deals with an alternative to war and terrorism. Let's watch Beyond War.
We're in the home of Nancy and Walter Cardinet, and they are the prime movers in Los Gatos of the Beyond War movement. Walt, would you please tell our viewers what Beyond War is all about?
Okay. First of all, it's really good to be here and to have the opportunity to be on this program. Basically, the Beyond War movement started about 3 years ago, or maybe about 3.5 years ago, when in New England, if you remember, there was the freeze. The freeze movement started, and there were hundreds of thousands of people, in fact, I think millions of people in Europe who were demonstrating against the installation of Pershing II missiles and cruise missiles, in Europe. Also, at that same time, in the New Yorker magazine, there was a series of articles written by Jonathan Schell called The Fate of the Earth, where he really wrote about the scenario of what would happen if there was a nuclear war. And this was all going on at this time. At the same time, there was a group called the Physicians for Social Responsibility, which produced a film called The Last Epidemic. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it was a film that showed the medical consequences if there was a nuclear war. And when you saw that thing, you just realized that we really had a problem, that we've had nuclear weapons for 40 years, and that the problem really hasn't been solved. In fact, if you really examine the evidence, you see that the problem is actually worse now than it was before. So the Beyond War movement started out of a response to this environment that we found ourselves in. And when you say, well, what is Beyond War? First of all, we all have to say that we have a problem. I mean, it's pretty well accepted that we do face the possibility of extinction with the weapons that we have. And there really have been 2 approaches to solve the problem. And the first approach has been to build more bombs. Okay, that as long as we build more bombs, neither side will attack each other. The second point of view on how to solve the problem has been to get rid of all bombs. And what we're saying in the Beyond War movement as a response to this is to go to the actual root cause of the problem. And that is the way we think.
How many people are in Los Gatos?
Involved in the Beyond War movement?
Yeah.
We've got, I'd say actively involved, there's over 50 people at this point, isn't that right?
And then there are hundreds and hundreds of people who have been to interest presentations and been through what we call the Beyond War orientation.
In this handbook, you pretty well state what the objectives of the organization are, what the movement are. Mm-hmm. You state that there are 3 steps needed to bring about change. Could you please tell our viewers what those 3 steps are?
Okay. Nancy, would you like to do that?
Sure. The 3 steps that we talk about with this problem, or I think when you're trying to change anything, there are 3 things that are key. First, you have to have a clear perception or knowledge about what it is that you want to change, or about the reality of what you're talking about. And then one has to make a decision based on the knowledge of the reality that he sees. And then you would take action on that. For instance, when we had the drought here a couple years ago, do you remember when we were actually living on a little lake at that time, and we saw the lake dry up, and we saw that we had no water. And so we were able to see that we could not use water in the same way that we had before, and that we really had a problem and we had to do something about it. And we would liken that example to where we are in the world today. With the weapons that we have and the incredible technology, we can no longer use war as a way to resolve our conflicts. So that is seeing clearly where we are. And then, seeing that, we have to make a decision that we can no longer use war. Because to do so will be to the demise of all of us. And we have to see that we're all part of one system, and that we all breathe the same air, drink the same water. It's one giant ecosystem.
You mentioned that there needs to be a quantum leap in, I assume you mean thinking, because because I can't see a way that there would be a quantum leap in how we change. I
Right.
mean, people just don't boom change. So you're referring to a quantum leap in thinking. Boy, this doesn't make any sense. Stop, let's do something else. Boom. Okay, now, you think your handbook talks about 5 phases of social change. Could you please tell our viewers what those are?
There's a small group of people who see a situation first, get a new idea or whatever it is, and then they're called the innovators. And then what they do is that they communicate this new idea to, and what is it? It's about 3% of the population or 2% of the population. It's a very small percentage of what you would call innovators. And then they communicate the new idea to what is called the early adopters. These would be community leaders. People that are looked up to in the community that set the opinion as to what is right and what is wrong or the way things are, okay? And then once the early adopters accept the idea, then they communicate the idea to what is called the early adopters.
The early majority.
Excuse me, the early majority. And then the early majority communicates the idea to the late majority, and then the last group they're sometimes termed as laggards or very late adopters, okay?
Well, how long does this process take, typically?
Well, when we decided that slavery was no longer a viable way of treating people, that took 150 years, or
We don't
maybe
have
even
that kind
longer.
of time now, though.
That's
do we?
right.
Right, but the point I'm going to make is there also was not the incredible communications system that we have now. As an example, when the Volkswagen came over the States, I mean, it didn't take very long, in a couple of years, and all of a sudden Volkswagens were sold all over the place. And there's various other examples of ideas that they're not at the magnitude that we're talking of, but still there are ideas that because of television, satellite communications, I mean, the whole world is so much closer together now that actually ideas flow very quickly.
So we should be able to do things fairly quickly now. So we're in the early stages of development of the whole movement.
Right.
Okay, now, you had mentioned something about awareness,
Right.
that in order to get into the next stage, that the innovators have to make the first adopters somewhat aware. You are doing some specific things that are making people aware. Would you please tell our viewers what those things are?
I was just going to go back to something you said, and it's so important that perception is key to everything, because when our perception changes, that determines our behavior. And so it's just important to really see, and when we do see that we have to change because of the environment, then we will do that. So it is important, and that's what we're all about. And so all of our programs and the events and things that we have going is with that in mind, and that we feel that when people really see that we can no longer have war, that they will change.
But do you think that's going to happen automatically, Nancy?
No, I don't think, I wish it were. I think if it would, we wouldn't be in the predicament that we're in today.
I have very little problem visualizing people like us in Russia. Okay, and I'm going to ask you a question that probably somebody in Russia would ask also. And that is, you have a theory that we cannot survive a nuclear war. What do you say to the President of the United States, who thinks we can?
Well, I don't think, actually, he has said now that he doesn't think that we could survive a nuclear war. So I think we're
He's
making...
changed his position.
I think we're making progress. I think that's pretty well known that we talked a few years ago about limited nuclear war. That's when people begin to really, I think, educate themselves
Or
and
get
see.
upset.
Yeah, right.
Because what I see happening, and you see it happening in almost every type of crisis when you're talking, I mean, did you see last night on TV, this hostage, the guy who was holding the hostage just said, hey, let me come home to you, with you. When we let you go, I want to come home with you. Isn't that kind of interesting that when you start bringing it down to people, it seems to be all roses. But what do you do when you're talking government to government? Because I want to quote you something from your thing under questions and answers. What about the Russians? Because people are going to ask, what about the Russians?
That's always one of the first questions.
Can we trust them? Okay. I'm going to quote Paul Warneke. Quote, the Soviets live up to the letter, and you can emphasize the letter, of an arms control agreement, unquote. Isn't there current evidence that the Russians are in fact violating sections of SALT II agreement? Didn't Neville Chamberlain tell us we could trust Hitler? Didn't the Russians trust Hitler? How can we really trust the Russians?
Well, that's really a good question, and I think it's one that when you talk about this whole issue and you begin to get involved in looking at the evidence, it is a question that has to be answered. You have to face the question personally, and you know, there's a lot of you can read the papers, and there are those who write articles that say that the Russians are breaking SALT II. Then there's others who say that the Russians are living up to SALT II. And there's the main question about SALT II comes down to a big radar facility that the Soviets built out in the tundra somewhere. And I don't want to get into the arguments and the specifics of that, but that's the main argument around this, whether the Russians are living up to SALT II or not, or comparing the Russians with Hitler. You know, that's another argument that can go on, and you can take either side of it. But what it really comes down to when you look at this whole issue is, in a way, those kinds of questions about trusting the Russians and that, in a way, are irrelevant. And the reason why I say that is because when you look, again, back to the situation that we're in, and we've been talking about perception, is that we are facing extinction right now. You say, well, what about the Russians? You can't trust the Russians. Well, the reality is we are facing extinction. We don't have any choice. We have to learn how to go about how to work with the Russians. And there's one thing that the Soviets have in common with us, and that is that they want to survive. And we want to survive. And so we have to find ways to do that, but we're not going to find ways to do that until we really see that we're really up against it. So when you say, well, it's a risk to try to work with the Russians, well, we're already at risk about becoming extinct.
Okay, let's assume for a moment that we as Americans and our president and the Russians and Gorbachev, we're all convinced. This makes sense. We agree we're not going to have any more war. We're just going to start shutting down. Question. What do you do with the loonies? What do you do with the Khomeinis? Look what they're doing to us. I wouldn't even say it's 0.01% of the world population. It's like a grain of salt has brought this planet to a halt. Because when you bring the President of the United States, when you don't allow him to devote his time to running our government, and whether other people like it or not, when we run, the world runs. When you have one guy like that who thinks it's honorable to run a car and kill a bunch of people, what do you do with him?
That's another a good question, and it's really a tough question. When you look at it, and you look at the reality is, once they've taken a group of people as hostage, or once they've driven the truck into the embassy, I mean, it's all over. It's too late. And what we're doing is we're spending all of our energy worrying about what to do, after we're in these types of situations, okay? And really what we have to do is, it's the same thing as, instead of spending all of your energy on how to protect yourself against that enemy, is you really have to change the way you think, and you have to look at it and you say, this has happened, my gosh, but what is causing it to happen?
Okay, we all agree that modeling is good, that it works. Okay, now, be a model. How would you handle the present hostage situation, or even better yet, let's assume that's going to get solved. What would you do to prevent future hostage situations? Because I think our viewers would want to know if Beyond War is going to work, and if we can get the two major nations of the world to cooperate, then how does Beyond War deal with loonies? How would you handle it? All of a sudden you find out a jet's been halted in Beirut. What do you do?
Well, again, it's too late to do anything about what's going on right now, but the question is, what are you going to do about future possible hostage situations. And what you want to do, what you'd work to do, is try to prevent those from happening by increasing the security in the airports, opening up lines of communication that we don't have now between the nations of the East and the nations of the West. The other thing is, if the United States and the Soviet Union were really cooperating, it would totally change the dynamics of all the relationships of the nations around the world.
You do a very effective job in your book saying that, and I thought this was effective for me. They make an argument that we've never been invaded on our shores. The Russians have. Okay, now I stopped and thought about that. The Russians are really protecting, from their point of view, they are protecting what's important to them.
Right, they have 14 nations on their borders.
So if we all became Russians and started thinking from their point of view, what they do may make sense to us as Russians. Okay, idea. Why don't we stop and think what makes the loonies tick?
Exactly. You have to ask the question, why are the Shiites doing what they're doing? There's a reason why they're doing what they're doing.
We don't think
And
of
if we would stop and ask the question, why are they doing that, then maybe we'll come up with an answer that will lead us to a solution to the problem.
Right.
But we're not doing that. We're not saying, why are the Shiites doing what they're doing? We're saying, those Shiites don't have any value for life. What we're really saying is that the Shiites don't have the same opinion or the same way of approaching life as we do, therefore they have no value. Well, they do have a value, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
And I think that takes us from what we talked about, the old mode of thinking, which says, in order for me to survive, you have to go. And what we're talking about in this whole Beyond War movement is seeing the fact that we're all in this thing together. There's no such thing as a leak in your end of the boat. We are out there in space, a beautiful jewel hanging there. We are one, and we may not like it, as Walt said, that somebody has a different point of view, but that is exactly what we're up against, that we are one, and that we have to really see that.
I'm sure our viewers would be interested in finding out how they get in touch with you, number one. Number two, what's going on locally in town? Where can people go to see Beyond War in action?
Sure.
Go ahead. Why don't you answer that?
Okay, well, let's see. First, I would say that you could call Walt and myself. Our number is 356-5903 to find out about the events that are going on locally. We do Beyond War orientations, we have talks going on, luncheons, a lot of different kinds of presentations, and I think probably many of you in town saw a big banner that we had up on John Paul's restaurant a few weeks ago when we had a fundraiser at Kotani Inn, because all of the volunteers all across the country, the men that have taken leaves to work full-time on this, were all volunteers, and so we had a fundraiser there. Let's see, there is an event that's coming up on July 30th that we'd like to invite everybody to, and that is a preview showing of the Beyond War Space Bridge that we're having to generate interest for the big showing that will be on KQED the week of September 8th. So you will be seeing posters and flyers around town with, it's a beautiful poster, the skyline of Moscow and the skyline of San Francisco. And so you can be looking at, it will be right at our local neighborhood center, 208 East Main Street, and so we would encourage everybody to come. What else, Paul?
And I would like to say one last thing, and that is that this problem is a problem that we all have. It's not just a problem for the people who are involved in Beyond War. It's
or that work at Lockheed, or...
It's for everybody. President Reagan, the people in the defense industry, the people working on Beyond War, whatever. We need everybody to get involved in this thing to solve this problem. And we're talking about the biggest shift that has ever taken place in the history of mankind in the way we think. We have been warring for 10,000 years, and now what we're talking about is a movement that is going to move the world beyond war. And we need everybody to get involved in it. This movement is growing so fast, we need people to come and get involved. There's so many jobs to do, so many things that we would just encourage you to come and work with us.
Walter, Nancy, thank you very much for your time. For Eye of the Cat, this is Lee Eggerman.
KCAT viewers are invited to an open house every Thursday at 6 p.m. on KCAT Channel 6. If you're selling a house or